Number 10. The buried forests of the Permian extinction. Long before humans existed, long before mammals inherited the ruins of older worlds, the Earth entered a disaster so severe that life itself nearly lost its hold on the planet. Around 252 million years ago, at the end of the Permian period, the world was not simply changing, it was breaking. Forests that had spread across ancient continents began to collapse. Oceans that had supported vast ecosystems turned hostile. Atmospheres shifted, temperatures rose, waters lost oxygen. Entire food chains failed from the bottom upward, and the result was the most devastating mass extinction ever recorded in the history of life. This was not the death of one kingdom, one species, or one region. It was a planetary crisis so extreme that nearly everything alive was forced into a final test of survival. The event is often called the Great Dying, and the name is not exaggerated. In the seas where life had flourished for hundreds of millions of years, most species vanished. Coral systems collapsed. Trilobites, which had survived earlier extinction events and dominated ancient oceans for ages, disappeared forever. On land, forests withered, insects declined, reptiles and amphibians suffered catastrophic losses, and entire habitats became graveyards written into rock. The deeper scientists look into the layers from this time, the more disturbing the picture becomes. This was not a clean impact, not a single explosion, not one day when the sky opened and the world ended. It was slower than that, and in some ways worse. The planet seems to have been poisoned through a chain reaction, one failure triggering another, until survival became the exception rather than the rule. One of the prime suspects lies in what is now Siberia, where one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history unfolded across an almost unimaginable scale. The Siberian traps did not erupt like an ordinary volcano with a single cone and a single blast. They spread lava across vast areas, releasing enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur gases, methane, and other climate-altering compounds into the atmosphere. The world warmed. Rainfall patterns changed. Acid rain may have damaged land ecosystems. Oceans absorbed heat and carbon, becoming more acidic and less able to hold oxygen. In the deeper waters, anoxic conditions expanded, creating dead zones where complex marine life could not survive. Some studies suggest that toxic microbes may have flourished in these suffocating seas, releasing gases that made the crisis even worse. It was not one weapon. It was the Earth turning several systems against life at once. What makes the Permian extinction so unsettling is not only the percentage of species that disappeared, it is the silence after the collapse. For millions of years afterward, ecosystems struggled to rebuild. The world that emerged was not simply the old world repaired. It was something different, a planet emptied enough for evolution to choose new winners. The extinction cleared the path for the rise of the archosaurs, the group that would eventually include dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and crocodilian relatives. In that sense, the later age of dinosaurs was built on the ruins of an older world, almost completely erased. Before the great reptiles ruled, before mammals waited in the shadows. Before humans became possible, there was a world of strange forests, armored creatures, vanished seas, and evolutionary experiments that ended without memory. The darkest part is that no witness could understand what was happening. There were no cities to abandon, no records to carve, no survivors capable of telling future generations that the sky had changed and the oceans had turned against them. The only testimony is buried in stone: chemical signals, fossil gaps, dead reefs, vanished lineages, and layers showing that life once came terrifyingly close to losing its future. When we talk about lost worlds, we often imagine ruins, temples, drowned cities, or forgotten civilizations. But the Permian world was lost on a deeper scale. It was not merely forgotten by history. It existed before history, before memory, before anything could mourn it. And yet every living thing today is descended from the few branches that passed through that narrow gate. The world we know did not rise from peace. It rose from the aftermath of the greatest biological disaster Earth has ever survived. Number 9. The Chicxulub impact and the last day of the dinosaurs. If the Permian extinction was a slow planetary poisoning, the disaster at the end of the Cretaceous was violence compressed into a single moment. Around 66 million years ago, an object from space, likely an asteroid several miles wide, entered Earth's atmosphere and struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. For more than 160 million years, dinosaurs had dominated the land. They had survived shifting continents, changing climates, volcanic episodes, rising seas, falling seas, and countless ecological struggles. Then the sky delivered something no strength, size, instinct, or evolutionary success could withstand. In one impact, the age of dinosaurs began to end. The force of the collision was almost beyond human imagination. The asteroid slammed into Earth with energy far greater than any weapon ever created. Rock vaporized, the crust opened. A crater roughly 180 kilometers wide was carved into the planet. The impact threw dust, molten debris, and vaporized material into the atmosphere. Across parts of the world, the sky may have filled with glowing fragments falling back like burning rain. Forests ignited, shockwaves traveled through the ground. Tsunamis surged outward from the impact region. Near the strike zone, survival would have been nearly impossible. But the real horror was not limited to the place where the asteroid landed. The real killing mechanism spread across the entire planet. As debris filled the atmosphere, sunlight was blocked. Photosynthesis faltered, plants died, food chains collapsed. In the oceans, plankton communities were disrupted, and the damage moved upward through marine ecosystems. On land, herbivores lost food, predators lost prey, and the great biological structure that had supported the dinosaurs began to fail. This is what makes the Chicxulub impact so terrifying. It was not only a blast, it was a global shutdown. The world did not need every dinosaur to die on the first day. It only needed the systems they depended on to break. Once the light dimmed and the food vanished, size became a weakness. The largest animals required the most energy, and in a starving world, giants became the least protected creatures on Earth. For decades, the idea that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs was controversial. Then scientists found a strange signal in the rock layers marking the end of the Cretaceous, an unusual concentration of iridium, an element rare in Earth's crust, but more common in extraterrestrial objects. Later, the buried Chicxulub crater was identified beneath the Yucatan region, matching the timing of the extinction. Around the world, the same boundary appears in stone like a thin line between two realities. Below it, the old world of dinosaurs. Above it, a changed planet where many of the dominant creatures were gone. That boundary is one of the closest things geology has to a crime scene. But the disaster did not erase all life. Birds, the surviving branch of theropod dinosaurs, endured. Small mammals survived in the shadows. Crocodilians, turtles, frogs, insects, and many other groups passed through the collapse in reduced, battered forms. Survival favored the small, the adaptable, the hidden. The creatures that could burrow, scavenge, eat seeds, endure darkness, or wait out the worst years. The world after Chicxulub was not empty, but it was wounded. The great dinosaurs that had shaped ecosystems across the continents were gone. The skies lost many of their flying reptiles. The seas lost their giant marine reptiles. Ancient food webs unraveled, and in the space left behind, mammals began their long rise. What makes this event so powerful for human history is that we are living inside its aftermath. Had that asteroid missed Earth by a small margin, had it struck deep ocean instead of sulfur-rich rock, had the timing been different, the story of life might have taken another path entirely. Dinosaurs may have continued dominating terrestrial ecosystems. Mammals may have remained small, nocturnal, and marginal. Primates may never have gained the opening that eventually led to us. Every city, every language, every empire, every human memory exists in a world made possible by a catastrophe that happened tens of millions of years before the first human hand touched stone. The last day of the dinosaurs was not truly one day, but the impact gave it a beginning sharp enough to haunt the imagination. Somewhere in that ancient world, creatures looked up at a bright object cutting through the sky without knowing that the age they belonged to was ending. They had no prophecy, no warning, no way to understand that the heavens had chosen their extinction. The asteroid did not only kill animals, it closed a chapter of Earth so vast that human civilization seems like a footnote beside it. And in the darkness that followed, beneath ash-filled skies and broken forests, the future quietly changed owners. Number 8. The Missoula Floods that rebuilt a continent. At the end of the last ice age, Western North America held a weapon made of water. It was not an ocean, not a river, not a storm, but a trapped inland sea sealed behind a wall of ice. This body of water is known today as Glacial Lake Missoula, and when the ice dam holding it finally failed, the flood that escaped was so violent that it did not merely wash across the land. It carved the land into a new shape. For thousands of years, parts of what are now Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon were transformed again and again by sudden releases of water on a scale so extreme that early geologists struggled to believe such floods could have happened at all. During the final stages of the Ice Age, a lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet blocked the Clark Fork River, creating a vast lake behind it. As meltwater gathered, the lake grew deeper and heavier, pressing against the frozen barrier that imprisoned it. The landscape around it may have looked deceptively still. Cold valleys, glacial slopes, quiet water, stretching across a basin where land should have been. But the stillness was temporary. Ice is not stone. It can crack, float, weaken, and fail. When the pressure became too great, the dam gave way, and a wall of water burst westward with a force that would make ordinary floods seem almost harmless by comparison. The floodwaters surged across the Pacific Northwest at incredible speed, ripping through valleys, stripping soil from bedrock, carrying boulders larger than houses and creating landscapes that looked as if they had been attacked by something impossible. In eastern Washington, the water scoured the ground into what became known as the channeled scablands, a region of dry channels, giant ripple marks, plunge pools, coulees, and cliffs carved by water moving with catastrophic force. These were not the marks of slow erosion over millions of years. They were scars of violence, evidence that a continent had been briefly overwhelmed by a moving inland sea. What makes the Missoula floods especially disturbing is that they did not happen only once. The ice dam appears to have failed repeatedly, perhaps dozens of times, each cycle rebuilding the lake and then releasing it again. A world could recover from one disaster only to face another version of the same destruction generations later. Water would gather in silence, the ice would hold, pressure would build, and then the barrier would break. The land below the dam was never simply living after a flood. It was living between floods. Every valley, plain, and lowland in the path of that water existed under a delayed sentence written into ice. For a long time, many scientists resisted the idea. The scale seemed too large, the landforms too dramatic, the explanation too sudden. Geology had often been understood through slow processes, rivers cutting gradually, wind shaping slowly, time doing its quiet work. But the scablands did not fit that gentle picture. Geologist J. Harlan Bretz argued in the early 20th century that only catastrophic flooding could explain the evidence, and for years his interpretation was dismissed because it sounded too extreme. Eventually, the land itself won the argument. Giant current ripples, flood-carried boulders, enormous dry channels, and deposits spread across the region all pointed toward the same conclusion. Water had done this, but not ordinary water. A trapped glacial lake had broken free with the force of a temporary ocean. The human presence during these floods remains difficult to frame because the timing overlaps the late Ice Age world, when people were moving through North America in ways still debated and studied. Whether human groups witnessed some of the later flood episodes directly is uncertain, but the landscape that later peoples inherited had been reshaped by disasters beyond normal imagination. Rivers changed course, valleys were stripped, soil was removed, basalt was exposed. Entire ecological zones were altered by water moving so violently that it created new geography in hours and days, rather than centuries. The Pacific Northwest became, in part, a monument to repeated collapse. The darkest lesson of the Missoula Floods is that destruction does not always come from the sea or the sky. Sometimes it waits inland, behind a natural barrier that appears solid, until the moment it is not. A frozen wall can hold back a lake for years, and then fail so suddenly that everything downstream becomes temporary. The floods left no written witness, no ancient warning carved into stone, no names of those who may have seen the horizon turn into water. What remains are the scars, dry waterfalls where no river now flows, ripples too large for any normal stream, stones carried far from home, and channels that look like the remains of a world washed clean by force. The Missoula Floods did not erase a civilization in the way later disasters would, but they erased landscapes, rewrote ecosystems, and proved that even continents can be edited by catastrophe. Number 7. The Storegga tsunami and the final death of Doggerland. There was once a land between Britain and Europe, a world of marshes, rivers, forests, hunting grounds, and human movement where today there is only the cold water of the North Sea. This lost landscape is known as Doggerland, and for thousands of years after the last ice age, it was not a myth or an empty plain. It was home. People crossed it, hunted across it, followed animals through it, gathered plants from it, and may have buried their dead in ground that now lies beneath waves. But as the climate warmed and sea levels rose, Doggerland began to shrink. Coastlines moved inward, lowlands flooded, rivers became estuaries. A homeland that had once connected worlds slowly broke apart into islands and wetlands. Then, around 8,150 years ago, disaster came from beneath the sea. Off the coast of Norway, a massive section of the continental shelf collapsed in one of the largest known submarine landslides in Earth's history. The Storegga slide was not visible before it happened. There was no smoking mountain, no dark cloud, no obvious enemy rising on the horizon. A huge volume of sediment simply gave way underwater, sliding into the deep ocean and displacing enough water to send tsunamis racing across the North Atlantic. The wave moved faster than any person could flee, faster than any warning could travel, and when it reached vulnerable coastlines, it arrived not as a storm surge but as a wall of water from a sea that had suddenly changed its rules. The coasts of Norway, Scotland, the Shetland Islands, and surrounding regions were struck with devastating force. Geological deposits show that water reached far above normal sea level in some places, carrying sand, shells, and marine debris inland where the sea had no ordinary reason to be. For coastal communities, the experience must have been incomprehensible. The ocean withdrew or shifted, then returned with violent speed. Low-lying settlements would have had almost no time to react. Tools, shelters, food stores, boats, paths, camps and bodies could have been swept away in minutes. But the most haunting target of the Storegga tsunami may have been Doggerland, already weakened by rising seas and reduced from a vast territory into fragile remnants. By this time, Doggerland was no longer the great land bridge it had once been. Much of it had already vanished beneath the North Sea. What remained may have been a chain of low islands, marshy zones, sandbanks, and coastal flats. These were exactly the kinds of places most vulnerable to a tsunami. There was little high ground, little protection, and no easy direction of escape once the water began moving across the landscape. For any people still living there, the Storegga wave may have been the final blow. The sea that had been slowly taking their world for generations may have suddenly finished the work in a single terrifying event. What makes Doggerland so powerful as a lost world is not only that it disappeared, but that it was real enough to leave fragments and silent enough to leave almost no story. Fishermen have pulled ancient bones, tools, and pieces of prehistoric life from the North Sea floor. Mammoth remains, antler points, flint artifacts, and traces of old environments have emerged from a place modern maps mark as water. These finds are like messages from a drowned country. They prove that people and animals once moved through that space, that rivers flowed there, that forests grew there, that life unfolded in a geography now erased from ordinary human imagination. The Storegga tsunami did not create the loss of Doggerland by itself. The drowning had already begun long before the wave arrived. That is part of what makes the story darker. Some disasters do not strike a stable world. They strike a dying one. The people of Doggerland, if any remained in the most vulnerable areas, may already have been adapting to retreat, moving camps, changing hunting routes, following the shoreline as it crawled inland, learning to live with a sea that kept taking more. Then the sea stopped moving slowly. It rose all at once. In that moment, centuries of gradual loss may have become a single memory of terror. The archaeological silence after such an event is almost unbearable. We do not know the names of the people who may have been killed. We do not know their languages, their rituals, their warnings, their stories of the water, or whether survivors carried the memory into later myth. We only know that a real landscape vanished and that a major tsunami struck the region at a moment when the last remnants of that landscape were already fragile. The rest is buried under sand, sediment, and cold water. Doggerland is not lost because people forgot to write about it. It is lost because it disappeared before writing could save it. And that is why the Storegga tsunami feels less like a single natural disaster and more like the closing of a door between Britain and Europe, a door between land and sea, a door between a human world we might have known and one that was physically removed from the surface of the earth. Today, ships pass above it. Fishing nets scrape pieces of it from the seabed. Scientists map its buried rivers with seismic data. But the world itself is gone. The Storegga wave did not merely flood a coast. It helped seal a homeland beneath the North Sea, leaving behind one of prehistory's most haunting absences. A country without ruins, a people without records, and a disaster remembered only by the shape of the seafloor. Number 6. The Nile drought that broke the Old Kingdom. For ancient Egypt, the Nile was more than a river. It was the clock, the road, the granary, the border between survival and collapse. Every year, the floodwaters rose from far to the south and spread across the valley, leaving behind dark, fertile silt that made farming possible in a land surrounded by desert. The kingdom could build pyramids because the river returned. It could feed laborers because the river returned. It could collect grain, organize taxes, support priests, raise armies, and maintain the image of divine kingship because the river returned. To the Egyptians, order itself depended on repetition. The sun rose, the Nile flooded, the fields grew, Pharaoh ruled. Then the rhythm weakened. Around the end of the Old Kingdom, after centuries of centralized power, something began to go wrong. The Nile floods became less reliable, some years were too low. Fields that had depended on predictable inundation could not produce enough food. Grain stores shrank. Local officials gained power as the central authority struggled to respond. Famine, migration, political fragmentation, and social stress spread through a civilization that had seemed almost permanent. The same kingdom that had built the Great Pyramid of Giza, that had turned stone into monuments of eternity, entered a period of crisis remembered as the First Intermediate Period. Egypt did not disappear from the world, but the old order cracked, and one of the most powerful states of the ancient world learned that even divine kingship could not command a river. What makes this collapse so unsettling is the contrast between Egypt's monuments and Egypt's vulnerability. The pyramids still stand because stone can survive almost anything, But the society that built them depended on water arriving at the right height in the right season year after year. Too much flood could destroy, too little flood could starve. The entire political system rested on a natural cycle no ruler truly controlled. When that cycle failed, the religious and administrative machinery of the kingdom began to lose its authority. Pharaoh was supposed to preserve Ma'at, the sacred order of the world, but a dry river valley made that promise harder to believe. A starving population does not live inside theology for long. It asks where the grain has gone. Texts from later periods preserve images of hunger, disorder, and social reversal, though historians debate how directly they describe the crisis itself. But the environmental problem behind the collapse is difficult to ignore. Paleoclimate evidence suggests that parts of northeastern Africa experienced severe aridity around this broad period, and low Nile floods would have placed unbearable pressure on an agricultural civilization built in a narrow green corridor. Unlike farming societies with broad rainfall zones, Egypt's life was concentrated along a river. The valley was rich, but it was also a trap. When the river was generous, it produced abundance. When it failed, there were few alternatives. The desert did not offer another harvest. The darker part is that the Nile did not need to vanish completely. It only needed to fail enough. Civilizations often collapse not because everything is destroyed at once, but because the margin of safety disappears. A few bad years can be endured. Repeated failures become political. Grain shortages become unrest. Local leaders become more important than distant kings. Temples and administrators compete for resources. People move, trust breaks. The center weakens not in a single dramatic explosion, but through the slow realization that the system can no longer protect those who live inside it. The Old Kingdom's collapse was not just an environmental crisis. It was a crisis of confidence in the entire structure of Egyptian order. That is why this disaster belongs among the most haunting ancient catastrophes. No asteroid struck the pyramids. No army needed to burn Memphis to the ground. No sea swallowed the Nile Valley. Instead, the river gave less than the civilization required, and the consequences moved upward through every layer of society. Farmers suffered first, then storehouses, then officials, then royal authority, then the idea that Egypt's world was stable because Egypt's gods and kings made it so. A river that had seemed eternal became uncertain, and uncertainty was enough to break the age of pyramid kings. Egypt survived, rebuilt, and later rose again. But the Old Kingdom never returned in the same form. The civilization continued, yet the illusion of permanence had been damaged. The Nile drought showed that even the most monumental societies are still biological systems in disguise. They are bodies needing food, fields needing water, people needing trust, governments needing surplus. Strip away the stone, the gold, the sacred titles, and what remains is simple and terrifying. If the flood does not come, the kingdom starves. The pyramids were built to speak of eternity, but the world that built them could be shaken by a river running low. Number 5. The Minoan catastrophe beneath Santorini. In the Bronze Age, long before classical Greece, there was a civilization in the Aegean that seemed to belong to the sea. The Minoans of Crete built palaces, painted walls with dolphins, dancers, bulls, ships, and processions, traded across the eastern Mediterranean, and developed a culture so vivid that its ruins still feel strangely alive. Their power did not look like the later empires of iron armies and walled capitals. It looked maritime, elegant, connected, wealthy, and confident. Their ships linked islands and coasts. Their palaces stored goods, organized labor, and displayed art of astonishing movement and color. Then the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, erupted with a force large enough to wound the entire region. The eruption was one of the most powerful volcanic events of the last several thousand years. Before the final catastrophe, the island may have given warnings: earthquakes, ashfall, tremors, smaller eruptions, signs that the ground itself had become unstable. At Akrotiri, the Bronze Age settlement buried under volcanic material, archaeologists found buildings, streets, frescoes, storage jars, and evidence of an advanced island town preserved under ash. But unlike Pompeii, human remains are notably absent, suggesting that many inhabitants may have escaped before the final destruction. That fact makes the site even more eerie. The city looks abandoned in advance of doom, as if people understood enough to leave but not enough to save the world around them. When Thera finally exploded, it tore open the island and sent ash high into the atmosphere. The eruption column darkened skies, pumice and volcanic debris spread across the sea. The collapse of the volcanic system helped generate tsunamis that moved through the Aegean toward nearby coasts, including northern Crete, the heartland of Minoan civilization. For a people whose strength depended on ports, ships, coastal settlements, and maritime trade, the sea itself became the weapon. Harbors could be smashed, fleets could be damaged or destroyed, coastal communities could be flooded, trade routes could be interrupted. A civilization built around connection could be crippled by losing the very networks that made it powerful. What makes the Minoan catastrophe especially haunting is that the eruption may not have destroyed the civilization instantly. Instead, it may have begun a chain of weakening. A single afternoon of tsunami damage could have broken ships, ports, warehouses, and coastal infrastructure. Ashfall could have harmed crops, contaminated water, and disrupted agriculture. Climatic effects from volcanic aerosols may have cooled regions or altered growing seasons. Trade partners may have suffered. Political rivals may have sensed weakness. In the decades after the eruption, Minoan power declined, and Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland eventually came to dominate Crete. The disaster did not need to erase every palace in one day. It only needed to damage the foundations of Minoan strength badly enough that recovery became impossible. The ruins of Akrotiri preserve the unsettling beauty of a world interrupted. There are painted rooms, multi-story buildings, drainage systems, vessels, stairways, and images of a society that did not look primitive or marginal. It looked organized, artistic, and deeply connected to the sea. That is what makes its burial so powerful. The ash did not preserve a backward place at the edge of history. It preserved one of the most sophisticated urban cultures of the Bronze Age Aegean, frozen at the moment before a volcanic island became a geological weapon. The people may have escaped the town, but their world did not escape the eruption. Later imagination has often connected Thera with the story of Atlantis, the tale of a powerful island society destroyed and swallowed by catastrophe. Whether that connection is literal, symbolic, or simply tempting, the reason it persists is obvious. Thera gives history the shape of myth, a brilliant island world, a sudden geological convulsion, the sea rising against civilization, and a culture that never fully regained its former place. Atlantis may not have been Minoan Crete, but the Minoan disaster shows why such stories survive. Sometimes the earth does exactly what myths say it can do. It opens, burns, drowns, and leaves later generations trying to decide whether the memory is legend or evidence. The darkest part of the Thera eruption is not that it destroyed an island. It is that it may have changed the balance of an entire civilization without leaving a clean explanation. The Minoans did not simply vanish in one cinematic moment. Their decline was tangled with eruption, tsunami, economic disruption, political change, and foreign takeover. That makes the disaster more realistic and more frightening. Ancient worlds rarely end with one perfect cause. They are weakened, struck, destabilized, and then overtaken by forces waiting nearby. Thera may have been the blow that turned Minoan confidence into vulnerability. Today, Santorini is famous for beauty, white buildings, blue domes, cliffs above a shining caldera. But that beauty is the rim of an old wound. The sea-filled crescent is not just scenery, it is the shape left behind after a volcano tore the island apart. Beneath the postcard surface is the memory of ash-darkened skies, fleeing islanders, shattered coasts, and a maritime civilization forced into decline. The Minoans left behind art full of motion and life, but the disaster that struck them left behind something colder, proof that even a culture commanding the sea can be broken when the sea is turned against it. Number 4. The Green Sahara that turned into a desert. Today the Sahara feels like the definition of emptiness. Dunes, stone plains, heat, distance, and horizons where water seems almost impossible. But that image is only the latest version of the place. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was not the desert we imagine now. It was a green world of grasslands, lakes, rivers, wetlands, animals, and human communities living in landscapes that would seem almost unreal if the evidence were not still carved into rock and buried beneath sand. Hippos, crocodiles, elephants, giraffes, cattle, fish, and people once belonged to regions that are now among the driest places on Earth. The Sahara did not begin as a dead zone. It became one. During the African humid period, stronger monsoon rains reached far north into what is now desert. Lakes expanded across basins that are now dry. Rivers flowed through landscapes where no permanent river exists today. Vegetation spread, animals followed, and people built lives around water that seemed dependable enough to organize movement, hunting, herding, fishing, and settlement. Ancient rock art across the Sahara preserves scenes that feel like messages from a different planet. Swimmers, cattle herders, boats, wild animals, and human figures moving through a world that no longer exists. These images are not fantasy. They are witnesses. They show that the Sahara once held enough life for people to remember it not as a barrier, but as a homeland. Then the rains began to retreat. Not instantly, not as a single day of disaster, but as a long withdrawal of the conditions that had made the Green Sahara possible. Earth's orbital cycles shifted the strength and position of the monsoon. Rainfall decreased, lakes shrank, grasslands thinned, rivers weakened, wetlands dried. A landscape that had supported animals and people started losing the systems that kept it alive. The change may have included feedback loops. Less vegetation meant less moisture returned to the air, which meant less rainfall, which meant even less vegetation. Once the drying passed certain thresholds, the world did not simply decline, it accelerated toward desert. What makes this disaster so disturbing is its slowness. A flood can kill in minutes, a volcano can bury a city in hours. But the death of the Green Sahara took generations, and that may have made it harder to understand while it was happening. One generation may have noticed that a lakeshore had moved farther away. Another may have found that grazing land no longer recovered after a dry season. Another may have abandoned a route their grandparents had used. Another may have stopped telling children about animals that no longer came. The catastrophe was not a single scream. It was a silence that expanded year by year until an entire world had been replaced by heat and dust. For the people living through it, the collapse of the Green Sahara was not an abstract climate event. It was the loss of waterholes, fishing grounds, pastures, hunting territories, sacred places, burial areas, and seasonal paths. Communities had to move, adapt, split apart, or concentrate around the few water sources that remained. As the interior became harsher, populations likely shifted toward river valleys and more reliable ecological refuges, especially the Nile. Some scholars have argued that this movement of people, animals, and knowledge may have helped shape the rise of complex societies in northeastern Africa. If that is true, then one of the great civilizations of the ancient world may have been partly born from climate refugees, leaving behind a dying green world. The Sahara's transformation also changes how we think about lost civilizations. Not every lost world leaves walls, temples, or cities. Some leave lake beds where water once reflected the sky. Some leave pollen trapped in sediment. Some leave animal bones in places those animals could never live today. Some leave paintings of cattle and swimmers on stone faces surrounded by desert. The people of the Green Sahara may not have built monuments like Egypt or Mesopotamia, but they inhabited a vast living world with its own roots, traditions, economies, and memories. When the climate turned, the desert did not only take land, it took context. It made their world look impossible to anyone born after the rain had gone. The most haunting part is that the Sahara still carries the evidence of its former life, but in a form that feels almost like accusation. Dry lake shorelines lie far from water. Fossil river channels cut through empty ground. Rock art shows animals that now belong hundreds of miles away. The desert remembers what it used to be, even if human history barely does. And that is the tragedy of the Green Sahara. It was not destroyed by a single enemy, and it did not vanish beneath the ocean or under volcanic ash. It died by losing the pattern of rain that sustained it. A world of lakes, grass, animals, and people became a desert so vast that later civilizations would treat it as a natural boundary, forgetting that it had once been a corridor of life. The Sahara did not begin as emptiness. Emptiness arrived slowly and then stayed. Number 3, the Black Sea flood and the memory of a drowned shore. Beneath the surface of the Black Sea lies one of prehistory's most haunting possibilities, the memory of a shoreline that no longer exists. Today, the Black Sea is a vast saltwater body connected to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus. But some researchers have argued that thousands of years ago it was smaller, lower, and less salty, with fertile land around its edges where early communities may have lived. Then, according to the most dramatic version of the hypothesis, rising waters from the Mediterranean broke through and poured into the basin, transforming a lower body of water into the sea we know now. If that happened rapidly, it would not have looked like ordinary coastal change. It would have looked like the world being swallowed. The idea is powerful because it connects geology with one of humanity's oldest fears, the flood that takes everything. A low shoreline would have offered exactly the things early farming communities needed: fresh water, fish, flat land, fertile soil, transportation routes, and a stable edge between land and lake. People living there would not have thought of themselves as doomed. They would have built homes, planted crops, buried relatives, marked paths, raised animals, and organized their lives around a familiar landscape. Then the water began to rise. Perhaps slowly at first, perhaps with terrifying speed if the breach was sudden enough. Fields nearest the shore would disappear, then paths, then houses, then graves. The map of daily life would move inland until the old world existed only beneath water. What makes the Black Sea flood hypothesis especially fascinating is the evidence hidden below the modern surface. Surveys have identified ancient shorelines now submerged deep underwater, and sediment cores show that the Black Sea changed dramatically from a different aquatic environment into a saltier marine system. The details remain debated. Some scientists argue for a rapid, catastrophic inflow. Others see a slower process unfolding over a longer period. But even the cautious version contains a dark truth. The Black Sea was once different, its margins changed, and land that could have supported people now lies beneath the sea. The debate is not over whether the region transformed. The debate is over how violently the transformation happened. If communities did live along those lost shores, their archaeology is trapped in one of the most difficult places imaginable. Unlike a buried city under desert sand, a drowned shoreline beneath deep water cannot be excavated easily. The Black Sea's depths preserve and conceal at the same time. Its lower layers are famously low in oxygen, meaning organic materials can survive in ways they would not elsewhere. But that also means the evidence lies in darkness, pressure, and isolation. Wooden structures, tools, plant remains, or traces of settlement might theoretically endure far below, but reaching them, proving what they are, and connecting them to a specific human story is another matter entirely. The sea becomes both archive and prison. This is why the Black Sea has attracted so much attention in discussions of ancient flood memories. Across the Near East and surrounding regions, flood stories appear in powerful forms, from Mesopotamian traditions to later biblical narratives. It would be too simple to claim that one geological event automatically created every flood myth, because human societies have witnessed many floods in many places. But the idea that a real drowned landscape could echo through cultural memory is difficult to dismiss. When water takes fields, homes, burial places, and ancestral ground, survivors do not remember it as a minor shoreline adjustment. They remember a before and an after. They remember a world that existed and then did not. The darker part is that if the most dramatic version of the flood occurred, the people living there may have had no language for the scale of what was happening. They could understand rain, they could understand rivers, they could understand storms, but an entire sea rising because distant waters had breached a natural gate would have seemed almost supernatural. The water would not stop because the source was not local. It would keep arriving from beyond the horizon, from a system larger than any village could comprehend. That is one of the most frightening patterns in ancient disaster. People often suffer consequences from forces they cannot see, cannot measure, and cannot imagine. Even if the Black Sea flood was slower than the most dramatic reconstructions suggest, the result remains haunting. A world of old shorelines vanished. Human possibilities were submerged. The places where people may have lived are now beneath water, deep enough to remove them from ordinary memory. There may be houses no one can reach, graves no one can mourn, and paths no foot has touched for thousands of years. Unlike ruins on land, they did not crumble into visibility. They disappeared into a dark basin where time works differently. That is why the Black Sea belongs on this list. It is not only a story about water levels, it is a story about how landscapes can be removed from history before history has a chance to name them. Somewhere beneath that surface may lie the remains of people who watched a familiar shore retreat beyond saving. Their world did not leave behind pyramids, palaces, or inscriptions. It left behind a question. How many ancient memories of divine floods began as real human grief standing at the edge of water that would not stop rising? Number 2. The Younger Dryas, freeze that stopped a warming world. Around 12,800 years ago, the Ice Age seemed to be losing its grip. Glaciers were retreating. Temperatures were rising, forests and grasslands were shifting into new patterns. Animals and humans were adapting to a planet that appeared to be moving toward a warmer, more stable future. Then something changed. The warming did not simply slow down. In parts of the northern hemisphere, it violently reversed. Cold returned with a speed that still unsettles climate scientists, and the world entered a period now known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden climatic relapse that lasted for more than 1,000 years. For the people alive at the time, this would not have felt like a neat geological phase. It would have felt like betrayal. Landscapes that had begun to open again hardened under cold. Growing seasons shortened. Animal ranges shifted, plants disappeared from familiar places. Rivers, wetlands, forests, and hunting grounds changed in ways no community could fully predict. The world had offered signs of recovery, then pulled them away. To human groups already living close to the edge, following herds, gathering seasonal foods, and learning the rhythms of post-Ice Age environments, that reversal could mean hunger, migration, conflict, and the loss of knowledge tied to places that no longer behaved as they once had. The cause remains debated, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the Younger Dryas so haunting. One major explanation points to enormous pulses of fresh water from melting ice sheets entering the North Atlantic, weakening the ocean circulation systems that carried heat northward. If warm currents slowed, temperatures across the region could drop sharply, dragging climate backward toward glacial conditions. Another, more controversial hypothesis suggests that a cosmic impact or airburst may have helped trigger fires, atmospheric disruption, and sudden cooling. Researchers continue to argue over the evidence. Meltwater roots, ice cores, platinum anomalies, microspherules, charcoal layers, and the timing of extinctions. But whatever the trigger was, the result is not imaginary. The climate shifted hard enough to leave a clear mark in ice, sediment, pollen, and the archaeological record. What makes this event especially disturbing is the timing. The Younger Dryas struck a world in transition. The great Ice Age megafauna were already under pressure from changing habitats and human hunting. Then the climate snapped colder. In North America and elsewhere, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, ancient horses, camels, and other large animals disappeared across a narrow and heavily studied window of time. The exact causes remain complex, but the feeling of the period is unmistakable. An old world was collapsing while a new one had not yet stabilized. Humans were not watching a single species vanish. They were living through the breakdown of an entire Ice Age ecosystem. The Clovis culture of North America, known for its distinctive fluted spear points, also changed around this period. The classic Clovis pattern fades from the archaeological record, replaced by different regional traditions. Whether this represents population collapse, adaptation, cultural transformation, or all of these at once remains debated. But the timing gives the Younger Dryas an almost mythic weight. A continent of giant animals, expanding human hunters, warming landscapes, and new possibilities suddenly entered a 1,000-year cold shadow. Whatever futures might have emerged from that earlier warming were interrupted. The darker truth is that humans survived the Younger Dryas, but survival is not the same as continuity. A people can live through a disaster and still lose their world. Roots vanish when herds move. Tools change when prey changes. Stories tied to places weaken when those places become unlivable. Children grow up in a climate their grandparents would not recognize. Over generations, the old map disappears, not because it is burned or drowned, but because it no longer works. The Younger Dryas was that kind of disaster, not always visible as one terrible moment, but powerful enough to redirect the lives of entire populations. And then, after more than a millennium, the cold ended. Temperatures rose again, in some regions extremely quickly, and the Holocene climate regime began to take shape. This warmer and more stable world would eventually allow agriculture, permanent settlements, and civilization as we know it. But that future arrived only after the planet had shown how abruptly it could change direction. The Younger Dryas is frightening because it stands at the gate of human civilization like a warning. Stability is not guaranteed. A warming world can freeze. A familiar landscape can become foreign. A species can survive and still lose almost everything it was building toward. Number 1. The 4.2 kiloyear drought that shattered Bronze Age. Civilizations. Around 4,200 years ago, after cities had risen, kings had ruled, trade routes had expanded, and early civilizations had begun to believe in their own permanence, the climate turned against them. This was not one local famine, one failed harvest, or one unlucky drought remembered by a single kingdom. It was a broad climatic disruption that affected regions across the ancient world, weakening rainfall patterns, stressing rivers, damaging agriculture, and pushing societies that had spent centuries building complexity into crisis. The event is now known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, and its shadow falls across some of the most important civilizations of the Bronze Age. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire, often described as one of the world's first great empires, entered collapse. Founded by Sargon of Akkad, it had joined cities and territories across a vast region through conquest, administration, tribute, and military power. But empire depends on food as much as armies. Northern Mesopotamia relied heavily on rainfall agriculture, and when aridity intensified, fields failed. Settlements were abandoned. Populations moved. Dust increased. The imperial system began to fracture under pressures no king could command away. The Akkadian collapse was not simply political weakness. It was a civilization discovering that power becomes fragile when the land can no longer feed the structure built on top of it. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom also weakened during this broad period of environmental stress. The civilization that had built the pyramids depended on the Nile's annual floods, and when those floods became unreliable or insufficient, the consequences moved through every level of society. Food shortages undermined central authority. Provincial leaders grew stronger, the unity of the kingdom gave way to fragmentation and the First Intermediate Period. Egypt survived, but the pyramid age of centralized Old Kingdom power ended. The monuments remained, but the system that had raised them was no longer secure. Farther east, the Indus Valley civilization, one of the great urban cultures of the ancient world, also entered a long decline. Cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-daro had been part of a vast civilization known for planned streets, drainage systems, standardized weights, craft production, and far-reaching trade. But shifts in monsoon patterns and river systems placed pressure on the agricultural foundations of urban life. Populations dispersed from major cities into smaller settlements. The great urban order faded. Unlike some ancient collapses marked by burned palaces or conquest inscriptions, the decline of the Indus world appears quieter, which makes it even more haunting. A civilization of millions did not need to vanish overnight to be lost. It only had to unravel until the cities no longer held the life that once made them powerful. What makes the 4.2 kiloyear event terrifying is the pattern. These societies were separated by distance, language, religion, politics, and worldview. The Akkadians did not understand the Indus decline. Egyptians suffering through low Nile floods did not know that cities far to the east were also weakening. Each civilization experienced its crisis as local, immediate, and probably unique. But from a modern perspective, the same broad climatic stress appears across multiple regions at roughly the same time. That is the frightening part. People lived inside separate disasters, but the planet was moving as one system. The collapse was not always sudden, and it was not identical everywhere. Some regions suffered drought, others experienced shifts in rivers, monsoons, settlement patterns, or social organization. Some cities fell quickly, others transformed slowly. Some traditions survived in altered forms. But the larger message is clear. Early civilization had become powerful enough to build cities, monuments, administrations, trade networks, writing systems, and kingship, but not powerful enough to escape climate. Agriculture created surplus. Surplus created cities. Cities created hierarchy, specialization, and empire. Then drought attacked the base of the entire structure. The most disturbing part is how familiar the mechanism feels. Failed rains become failed crops. Failed crops become migration. Migration becomes conflict over remaining resources. Central authority loses credibility. Local powers rise. Trade weakens. Tax systems fail. Elites can no longer perform protection. The story sounds ancient because it is ancient, but it also sounds modern because civilization has never stopped depending on climate stability. The 4.2 kiloyear event did not need to destroy every city directly. It only needed to make the assumptions behind those cities false for long enough. In 2018, the 4.2 kiloyear event was formally recognized as marking the beginning of the Megalion Age, a subdivision of the Holocene. That means this ancient climate crisis is not merely a historical episode. It is written into the geological naming of the time we still live in. The droughts ended, new kingdoms rose, Egypt reunited, Mesopotamia changed, South Asian societies transformed, human civilization continued. But the world after the event was not the same as the world before it. Bronze Age societies had learned at enormous cost that no wall, throne, temple, canal, or written law can fully protect a civilization from the sky refusing to rain. That is why the 4.2 kiloyear drought belongs at number 1. It was not the biggest explosion, not the tallest wave, not the loudest day of destruction. It was something colder, a planetary pressure that pushed multiple civilizations toward breakdown at the same time. It revealed that collapse does not always arrive as fire from heaven or water over the horizon. Sometimes it arrives as empty clouds, shrinking rivers, dust on fields, abandoned streets, and rulers slowly realizing that the world beneath their power has changed. The Bronze Age did not fall in one place for one reason. It cracked across continents because the climate moved, and humanity discovered that civilization is only as permanent as the conditions that allow it to breathe.